The Iranian radar operator had been watching the same clean screen for 6 hours. Nothing in the northern approach, nothing on the surface, nothing above it, then a signal. Not one contact, not two, three. Three carrier strike groups, the largest American naval force assembled in this region in 2 decades, had just crossed into his radar range simultaneously. 3 independent air wings, 3 nuclear-powered or conventionally powered warships at the center of each group. Destroyers, cruisers, submarines running silent beneath the surface. The IRGC had wargamed this conflict for years. They had built defensive architectures, mined choke points, trained asymmetric units, and rehearsed the geometry of fighting a superpower in a narrow body of water. They had never planned for 3. And there was nothing Tehran could do about it. Iran built its entire war strategy around 2 assumptions. First, American carriers would stay in the Arabian Sea, out of Persian Gulf range, behind the choke point. Safe, predictable, calibrated for standoff distance. Every Iranian defensive system was oriented toward that geometry. The minefields inside the strait, the coastal anti-ship batteries, the fast boat swarms designed to operate in the shallow littoral zones where carriers cannot safely maneuver. All of it was engineered around the assumption that the Americans would fight from outside. Second assumption, if one carrier was removed from the theater, American posture weakened. The loss of one strike group meant a gap in rotational coverage, a window, a moment of reduced aerial dominance that Iran's remaining missile force could attempt to exploit. The USS Gerald R. Ford caught fire on March 12th. She withdrew from the theater. IRGC propaganda ran for 2 weeks. State media called it a retreat. Iranian officials gave press conferences. The message to the Iranian public was clear. America had blinked. Tehran's negotiating team walked into ceasefire talks in Islamabad with that confidence sitting behind them like a second chair. They had miscalculated. Twice. Because while Iran was celebrating a withdrawal, a replacement was already underway. And it wasn't a like-for-like swap. It wasn't one carrier replacing one carrier. It was Carrier Strike Group 10. It was more than 5,000 personnel. It was Carrier Air Wing 7, combat certified, strike ready. It was 3 Arleigh Burke guided missile destroyers. And at the center of all of it was USS George H.W. Bush, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that had completed her composite training unit exercise on March 5th and departed Norfolk on March 31st, pointed directly at the strait. Iran's war math had already failed. The equation was about to get worse. To understand what just entered the strait, you need to understand what Iran thought it was facing and why that calculation made sense to them. Operation Epic Fury began with 2 carrier strike groups operating from the Arabian Sea, USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford. Iran's defensive architecture, its minefields, its Ghadir midget submarines, its land-based anti-ship missiles, its Shahed drone swarms launched from inland platforms was calibrated for exactly that geometry. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The navigable shipping lanes inside it are narrower still. Iran had spent years threading that choke point with undersea obstacles precisely because it knew it could never match American surface power ship for ship, sortie for sortie, missile for missile. What Iran could do was make the cost of entry prohibitive, make the geometry of the strait itself do the fighting that Iran's conventional military could not do alone. That logic held until it didn't. The Ford's fire changed the board, but not in the direction Iran imagined. CENTCOM did not reduce its posture. It replaced, then it added, and then it kept adding. Admiral Brad Cooper had 3 carrier strike groups, 2 amphibious ready groups, and more than 50,000 U.S. forces concentrated across the CENTCOM area of responsibility. That number, 50,000, deserves a moment because that is not a patrol posture. That is not a freedom of navigation demonstration. That is a war posture built for sustained combat operations against a regional power. And on April 13th, the same day ceasefire talks in Islamabad collapsed entirely, President Trump declared a full naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. 3 carriers, a blockade declaration, a 50,000-strong force, and a 21-mile choke point that Iran was still refusing to open. This is where the story gets complicated. The carrier, USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77. Start with the ship itself, because the ship matters. USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77, is a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. She displaces more than 100,000 tons fully loaded. To put that in context, she is heavier than the entire pre-war Iranian surface navy combined. She is powered by 2 nuclear reactors that do not require refueling for years. She exceeds 30 knots, fast enough that most conventional warships cannot maintain pace with her in a sprint. She carries approximately 70 aircraft and more than 5,000 personnel, her ship's company, her air wing, and the command staff that runs the entire strike group. Iran has no surface combatant that can engage her. Let that settle. Not, Iran's surface fleet is at a disadvantage. Not, the engagement would be difficult. Not, Iran would need to commit significant resources to threaten the carrier. Iran has no surface combatant that can engage her. The past tense is correct. What remained of Iran's conventional surface navy before this war began was already outmatched. What remains of it after weeks of Operation Epic Fury strikes is not a fleet. It is scattered wreckage and a handful of fast attack craft operating in coastal zones they cannot safely leave. The Bush's nuclear propulsion means she does not need a tanker convoy to sustain operations. She cannot be starved of fuel. She cannot be forced to withdraw because her supply chain was cut. She can generate sorties today, tomorrow, and the day after without a single logistical resupply for her reactors. She can fight indefinitely. Carrier Strike Group 10 entered the theater under the command of Rear Admiral Alexis Walker, escorting the Bush USS Ross DDG-71, USS Donald Cook DDG-75, USS Mason DDG-87, 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, each carrying Standard Missile interceptors for theater air defense, Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles for deep strike, and CIWS close-in weapon systems as the last line of defense against incoming missiles. The Bush had completed her composite training unit exercise, COM-2X, on March 5th. She departed Norfolk on March 31st, combat certified before she left the pier, ready before the order came. That is the carrier. Now understand what she brought with her: the electronic weapon, EA-18G Growler carrier. Air Wing 7 is the air power embarked on the Bush. That means VFA-83, VFA-103, VFA-105, and VFA-131. 4 strike fighter squadrons flying F/A-18E and F/A-18F Super Hornets. It means E-2D Hawkeye aircraft for airborne early warning and battle management. It means MH-60R Seahawk helicopters hunting submarines beneath the surface. And it means a capability that Iran's air defense planners understand and fear above almost anything else flying off an American carrier: the EA-18G Growler. On the outside, the Growler looks almost identical to a standard FA-18F Super Hornet. Same airframe, same engines, same performance envelope. What it carries internally and externally is completely different: the ALQ-99 Tactical Jamming System, electronic warfare suites, anti-radiation missiles designed to hunt radar emitters and destroy them. The Growler jams radar frequencies, it suppresses enemy air defense systems, it degrades the electromagnetic environment that Iranian SAM batteries, fire control radars, targeting acquisition systems, and communications networks depend on to function. And it does all of this without a single kinetic weapon being fired. Here is what that means in practice. Every time the Bush's Air Wing launches a strike package, every time a formation of Super Hornets lifts off that flight deck and heads toward a target, Iranian SAM operators lose partial situational awareness. Their radar returns become unreliable. Their targeting solutions begin to degrade. The lock-ons they were trained to achieve in fractions of a second become uncertain, then intermittent, then lost. Iran cannot target what it cannot track. And the Growler does not just protect the aircraft flying in its immediate formation, it degrades the entire Iranian air defense network, every installation inside its jamming range, every time it is airborne. Think about what that means operationally. Iran's Bavar 373 batteries, its SA-6 equivalents, its short-range point defense systems, its early warning radars that feed targeting data to the missile systems, all of it operates in the electromagnetic spectrum. All of it is vulnerable to a system specifically engineered over decades to defeat exactly that kind of architecture. The EA-18G Growler is an offensive capability. It fights in the electromagnetic domain so that every other aircraft in the strike package can fight in the physical domain without being shot at by a system that can see them. Iran spent years building an integrated air defense network. The Growler makes that network unreliable. That is a problem Iran cannot shoot its way out of. The geometry weapon, 3 carriers simultaneously. Now understand the third weapon, not a platform, not an electronic system, a geometry. 1 carrier strike group in the theater generates roughly 100 to 120 operational sorties per day. Strike missions, reconnaissance, electronic warfare, submarine hunting, around the clock, in rotation, with rest cycles built in for pilots and maintenance windows built in for aircraft. 2 carrier strike groups, which is what the US had before the Ford withdrew, generate approximately 240 sorties per day, substantially more coverage, but with gaps. Rotational gaps where coverage thins as one air wing cycles down and the other has not yet fully cycled up. Windows, small windows, but Iran was planning to use them. 3 carrier strike groups generate sustained air operations across multiple independent axes, around the clock, with no meaningful gap in rotational coverage over the Persian Gulf. Iran's entire air force, before Operation Epic Fury destroyed the majority of it, could not have engaged all 3 strike groups simultaneously. It did not have the aircraft, it did not have the trained pilots remaining, it did not have the command and control architecture needed to coordinate simultaneous multi-axis engagements against 3 independent carrier air wings operating in coordination with each other, with E-2D Hawkeyes providing battle management from altitude and with EA-18G Growlers degrading the Iranian systems trying to fight back. Now, after weeks of Epic Fury strikes, Iran cannot engage any of them. But here is the strategic point. 1 carrier leaves a gap, a rotation gap, a few hours every cycle where the coverage is thinner, where a massed missile salvo, timed precisely, might find a softer edge of the air defense umbrella. Iran had missiles, depleted but not gone. They were waiting for a gap. 3 carriers closed that gap permanently. There is no longer a window. There is no longer a soft hour in the rotation. The American air picture above the strait is now continuous, overlapping, and permanent. The Bush did not just add strike capacity to the theater, she closed the door on the one remaining offensive option Iran had in the air domain. Iran planned for 1 gap. They no longer have a gap to aim at. But here is what the headline misses. 3 carrier strike groups, 40-plus years of collective air wing experience concentrated in 1 theater, 2 amphibious-ready groups, 9 Arleigh Burke destroyers, total air superiority above the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. Iran's conventional navy is finished. Its air force is finished. Its ballistic missile stockpile is depleted after weeks of sustained exchange. Its integrated air defense network is degraded to the point where Iranian SAM operators are operating half-blind. And the USS George H.W. Bush, the most powerful aircraft carrier on Earth, is waiting outside the strait, waiting, because the Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide, and Iran spent years threading that choke point with the one category of weapon that 3 carrier air wings cannot simply bomb away. Sea mines, not surface ships, not submarines that can be tracked and killed, not aircraft that can be intercepted, mines, passive, inert, waiting on the seabed and in the water column of a 21-mile gap, each one a simple machine that cannot be jammed, cannot be electronically defeated, cannot be fooled by a decoy or blinded by a growler. Iran also maintained Qadir midget submarines, small, quiet, optimized for exactly this shallow water environment. The strait is their natural terrain, deep enough to hide, shallow enough that the acoustic environment degrades the sonar picture for any surface ship trying to sanitize the passage. And along the Iranian coastline above the strait, more than 1,000 miles of it, land-based nor anti-ship missile batteries sat in hardened positions that airstrikes had degraded but not eliminated, not yet. 3 carriers change the air picture above the strait. They do not clear the mines below it. The most powerful naval force assembled in this region in 20 years cannot simply sail through unopposed, not because Iran has ships left, not because Iran has aircraft left, because the geometry of the strait itself, 21 miles shallow water, mined approaches, coastal missile batteries on one side, gives Iran a weapon it cannot lose by losing a naval battle. Iran's last weapon is not a missile, it is not a submarine, It is not a drone swarm, it is geometry. There is a cost to what you're watching, and it is not small. The 60-day War Powers Resolution statutory clock, the legal framework that permits the president to deploy U.S. forces into hostilities without a congressional declaration of war, expires around April 28th to 29th, 2026. Congress has not authorized this war, the votes have not been taken, the authorizations have not been passed. Every additional day of operations after that expiry date adds legal and political pressure that Iran is watching and counting as carefully as its own missile inventory. Each carrier strike group costs approximately $10 million per day in operational expenses, fuel for the conventional vessels in the group, aviation fuel for the air wing, ordnance expended and needing replacement, maintenance on aircraft that are flying at wartime tempo, personnel costs for 5,000 people on a single ship. Multiply that across 3 carrier groups, 2 amphibious ready groups, the destroyers, the submarines, the logistics ships, keeping the entire force sustained. This war is spending money the Pentagon had not budgeted for, and the budget was already stretched before Epic Fury began. Then there is the stockpile problem. Patriot Advanced Capability Interceptor missiles, the primary layer of U.S. and Allied theater air defense against Iranian ballistic missiles, were already at approximately 25% of required war plan inventory levels before Operation Epic Fury's first strike, not 25% below optimal. 25% of what the war plan said were needed for sustained combat operations. The transfers to Ukraine over the prior 2 years had drawn those stockpiles down to a point that U.S. planners were already flagging as a vulnerability before a single shot was fired in this conflict. The Bush brings enormous strike capacity to the theater. She brings air wing depth. She brings electronic warfare. She brings another 3 Arleigh Burkes with full VLS magazines. She does not replenish the Patriot interceptors that have already been expended, and they are not being replaced fast enough. Every win has a cost. The Bush's arrival is a win, but the clock is running on the War Powers Resolution. The money is leaving the Treasury at a rate that has no clean end date, and the interceptor inventory that protects American forces from Iranian ballistic missiles, the missiles Iran has been firing at U.S. positions throughout this conflict, is a number that trends in one direction only. Iran knows all of this. Tehran can read the same clocks Washington is watching, and Iran is still refusing to open the strait, the blockade. Understand the scale of what the blockade declaration actually means. Up to 20 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Not per week, per day. That is approximately 20% of all seaborne oil trade on the entire planet passing through a gap 21 miles wide. A gap that, at this moment, the United States Navy has just declared off-limits to ships operating in violation of blockade terms. China receives approximately a third of its total oil supply via the strait, not a third of its imported oil. A third of all the oil China consumes, domestic and imported combined. Japan receives roughly 90% of its oil through that same passage. South Korea, India, every major Asian economy with energy dependencies that cannot be quickly rerouted runs its numbers through that choke point. Every day the blockade holds and the strait stays contested, those numbers do not move. Not legally, not without sailing into a confrontation with 3 carrier air wings, 9 Arleigh Burke destroyers, and a U.S. naval force that has just been given explicit blockade enforcement authority by the President of the United States. The Bush is part of the enforcement architecture. So is the Abraham Lincoln. So is every destroyer in the theater. This is not a diplomatic statement backed by a press release. It is a naval posture backed by more combined air power than most nations field in their entire air forces. And the consequences extend well past the Persian Gulf. Beijing is watching the energy dependency it has spent 2 decades trying to reduce become a foreign policy pressure point in someone else's war. China receives a third of its oil through a choke point currently under American blockade. That is not a comfortable position for a rising power that has spent 20 years building military capability specifically to avoid being coerced by American naval dominance. This is not just an American-Iranian conflict. It has not been for days. This is a global economic event being enforced at gunpoint. the gunpoint of the most powerful naval force the United States has assembled in this region since the Cold War ended. Every tanker captain in the Indian Ocean is running the same calculation right now. Every energy minister in Asia is looking at reserve levels and timelines. Every central bank with exposure to oil-denominated assets is watching a 21-mile gap on a map and doing arithmetic it does not like. The human stakes. There are more than 5,000 people aboard that carrier right now. They are someone's kid, someone from a small American town, from Portsmouth, Virginia, or Corpus Christi, Texas, or Bremerton, Washington, who raised their right hand and joined the Kiesi, United States Navy, and went through training and reported to Naval Station Norfolk in the winter of 2025 and stood on that flight deck as she departed on March 31st, 2026. They woke up this morning as the tip of the most powerful naval force on Earth pointed at a 21-mile gap that Iran is still refusing to open. They are not abstract geopolitical leverage. They are 19-year-old aviation ordnance men loading live weapons onto the pylons of Super Hornets in the pre-dawn dark, wearing yellow jerseys, hands moving fast because the cycle schedule doesn't wait. They are 23-year-old sonar operators in a darkened compartment below the waterline, headphones on, listening to the acoustic environment of the strait for the signature of a Ghadir midget submarine operating in water shallow enough to hide in. They are pilots in ready rooms running through mission briefs for strike packages against targets that are real, not simulated. They are EA-18GE Growler crews who know that their aircraft is the reason Iranian radar operators cannot lock onto the formation flying behind them. Every one of them is doing a job that carries real risk. The strait is mined. The coastal batteries are not all destroyed. The Ghadir submarines are real. And every one of them is doing it because someone in Washington decided that the most important waterway in the world needed to be opened, and that the way to open it was to send everything. The George H.W. Bush carries 70 aircraft and the weight of a blockade declaration and the lives of 5,000 Americans who left Norfolk 2 weeks ago and have not been home since. Iran knows what it is facing, and it is still saying no. Resolution. Here is what the board looks like on April 13, 2026. All of it, clearly. On the American side, USS Abraham Lincoln, operational in the theater. USS George H.W. Bush, arrived, combat certified, nuclear-powered Carrier Air Wing 7 embarked. 2 amphibious-ready groups with Marine Expeditionary units embarked and ready. 9 Arleigh Burke guided missile destroyers, an unknown number of attack submarines operating without public acknowledgement in the approaches to the strait. More than 50,000 U.S. forces in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, a declared naval blockade, and the full air power of 3 independent carrier air wings generating continuous coverage above the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. On the Iranian side, a conventional navy effectively neutralized by weeks of surface engagements and airstrikes. An air force decimated, the majority of its combat aircraft destroyed on the ground or in the air during the opening phases of Epic Fury before they could generate meaningful resistance. A ballistic missile stockpile significantly depleted by sustained exchange against U.S. and allied positions and the interceptor batteries defending them. A negotiating position that collapsed alongside the Islamabad ceasefire talks on April 12th. And at Shishain, international posture that has not attracted the coalition support Tehran had quietly hoped would materialize. What Iran still has, the minefield seeded inside the strait over years of patient preparation. Ghadir midget submarines operating in shallow water where the acoustic environment favors the defender. Land-based anti-ship missile batteries embedded in Iranian coastal terrain that airstrikes have degraded but have not yet fully suppressed. And the geometry, always the geometry. 21 miles and a seabed full of mines, and the simple geographic fact that 3 carriers make the air above the Strait American and change nothing about the water beneath it. The equation is not close. Iran is not winning this war. Every metric of conventional military power favors the United States by a margin that is not a margin. It is a different category entirely. But Iran does not need to win. Iran needs to make winning expensive enough that the war power's clock runs out, or the money runs low enough that the calculus in Washington shifts, or a mine detonates under a destroyer hull, and the domestic political cost of staying rises faster than the strategic cost of leaving. Iran cannot defeat the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf, but Iran can make the United States Navy pay to be there, and that is what it is going to do. Iran closed the most important waterway in the world. America sent 3 carriers to open it. The largest fleet in the region is still waiting to go through.